The voiced alveolar flap consonant is an allophone of both the t and d phonemes, the t and the d. It's produced very much like the d sound, except that the contact between the tongue blade and the alveolar ridge is very brief, which is why it's sometimes also called a tap. In other words, instead of completely making the d, you just tap the tongue blade briefly against the alveolar ridge, barely interrupting the airflow, compared to the longer stoppage of airflow that you make for the true d sound. Most talkers make an alveolar flap as the middle sound in the words butter and ladder. Listen as I say these words with and without the alveolar flap. Butter versus butter, and ladder versus ladder. Even though the alveolar flap is an allophone of the t and d phonemes, we will transcribe it in broad transcription. You will need to learn to distinguish the difference between the alveolar flap and the d sound, as in dog. As you listen, the biggest difference between the two is that the alveolar flap is much briefer than the d. Listen again. Ladder versus ladder. The context in which the alveolar flap is most likely to occur is as an allophone of t or d in the intervocalic position, or in between two vowels, following a stressed syllable, or between two unstressed syllables, particularly in the middle of the word, but sometimes also between one word and the next as well. For example, I can say, got a lift, and the t at the end of got is a flap. In handwritten transcription, you make the flap by drawing a small hook. It looks like the printed letter R, lowercase, without the vertical line part, and then you make a small horizontal foot at the bottom. Your textbook has some good exercises for learning to hear the difference between the T, the D, and the alveolar flap, but let's try a few examples. In this exercise, your job is to determine whether the T or D letters in the following words should be transcribed using the T symbol, the D symbol, or the alveolar flap. Here's the first set. Token, bitter, adore, casting. Pause the recording and write down your answers. You can scroll back and listen again if you need to. Here are the answers, as well as a transcription of each word. If you didn't get the right answers, go back and listen to the words again. Here's the next set. There may be more than one allophone of T or D in these words. Baddest, tick, atom, attitude. The answers are shown below. The next new sound that we'll discuss is the glottal stop. Like the alveolar flap, the glottal stop is an allophone of the T phoneme, but it's usually found in different contexts, depending on the person's dialect. You make the glottal stop symbol by making a question mark without the dot at the bottom, and then drawing a small foot across the bottom. The glottal stop is made by briefly tapping the vocal folds against one another without their actually vibrating. Therefore, even though the vocal folds close during the production of the glottal stop, it is categorized as a voiceless stop consonant. So the articulation of the glottal stop happens in the glottis. Try making it. It's the middle sound in the word uh-oh. Try it. Uh-oh. You can feel that your mouth is open and the sound is happening in your larynx. Like in the word uh-oh, the glottal stop is sometimes found intervocalically to indicate the boundary between adjacent vowels in different syllables. It can also sometimes be heard when the word begins with a vowel. Here's an example with and without a glottal stop in a vowel initial word. Ankle versus ankle. The difference is subtle, but it's one that you should try to learn how to hear, because some children with phonological disorders replace initial consonants with a glottal stop. That can make it sound to a listener like there is no consonant there at all, but in fact the child is trying to make a sound in that position. The glottal stop is also an allophone of T that occurs in word final position, or between the vowel and a following unstressed syllable, particularly ones that end in en, like the words kitten and mitten. Notice the term homoorganic on the slide. It refers to two or more sounds having the same place of articulation. We are used to thinking of the glottal stop as a variant of the T sound, and it can be really hard to tell the difference between a glottal stop and an unreleased T, in part due to perceptual bias. One thing that can help you tell the difference is that the glottal stop tends to have a creaky, like that, voice quality around it because of the abrupt closure of the vocal folds. Also, sometimes it's easier to hear glottal stops in places that you don't expect them. A dialect of English that is used in London, called Cockney, puts glottal stops between vowels where we would normally have a flap. This is something like the variety of English spoken by the Geico gecko. For example, instead of butter, where we would put a flap, the gecko says butter. Once you get used to listening for them, you'll find that glottal stops are a lot more common than you think, even in your own dialect. The mid-sagittal section figure for the glottal stop is different from those for other consonants because the tongue and lips have no particular place of constriction. We say that there is a neutral configuration of the tongue and lips because the glottis is the place of articulation. Because the place of articulation is the glottis, I've drawn a double line rather than a single line for the vocal folds. The glottal stop is the only phoneme for which you'll see this double line for the vocal folds. The lines are straight because the glottal stop is considered a voiceless sound. Notice also that the velum is raised in the production of the glottal stop. Your textbook has some good exercises for learning to hear the difference between the glottal stop, the T, the D, and the alveolar flap. But here are a few examples. In this exercise, your job is to determine whether a glottal stop should be transcribed or not in the underlined portions of the words I pronounce. Here's the first set: reality, button, create. Back up and play the words again if you need to. Pause the recording and write down your answers. Here are the answers, as well as a transcription of each word. If you didn't get the right answers, go back and listen to the words again. Here's another set: mountain, aorta, Hawaii. Back up and play the words again if you need to. Pause the recording and write down your answers. Here are the answers, as well as a transcription of each word. If you didn't get the right answers, go back and listen to the words again. Sometimes the position of a stop can change slightly depending on the articulation of the surrounding sounds. Velar stops in particular can be noticeably different in their pronunciation depending on whether they are produced preceding front vowels or back vowels. Listen to the difference in the words key versus coop. Here are just the initial phonemes themselves, k versus k. Pause the recording and try feeling the position of your lips and tongue as you first say the k in the word key versus in the word coop. For the word key, the tongue constriction is a little further forward or fronted towards the hard palate, and your lips are probably spread in anticipation of the upcoming E vowel. For the word coop, the tongue constriction is more towards the velum, but your lips are probably rounded in anticipation of the U vowel. These small differences make the quality of the sound and the release of the stop quite different. K, k. For now, we will transcribe the two versions of this consonant the same because they are allophones of the same phoneme. But the difference in sound quality can be noticeable, and if fronting is extreme, it can cause listener confusion because the k sound in keep may start to sound like the t sound in to if it is extremely fronted. It's important to practice transcription of the stop consonants before moving on, particularly those that have just been introduced, the alveolar flap and the glottal stop. Pause the recording here and complete exercise 5.1 before continuing. Check your answers in the back of the book to make sure that you understand. This is the end of Part 2 of Module 4.